Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Erica. I'm the author of the blog This Simple Home Place, and I'm back from a short break that I took for the holidays, and we are gonna do a really fun DIY today. I'm gonna show you how to make beeswax wraps. So first off, I want to talk about what beeswax wraps are, why you might want to use them, and some pros and cons. If you don't want to listen to all of this and you just want to skip to the tutorial, I'll have the timestamps down below in the description so you can go ahead and skip to that part of the video. But first up, let's talk about what are beeswax wraps. So they're usually a piece of fabric, cotton, linen, something that's breathable, that is coated in a mixture of beeswax and other ingredients. The other ingredients usually are jojoba oil and pine resin. However, you can make them with just beeswax. And I will be showing you two different methods, one with beeswax and an iron, and then the other is going to be with beeswax, jojoba oil, and pine resin, and we're gonna use a double broiler method. I'm gonna go through all of that. Again, check the timestamps below if you want to skip to that part of the video. But what are they used for? So really, in a kitchen, they are used to wrap fruits. You know, if you cut half an apple and you want to save the other half for later, you can go ahead and wrap it in a beeswax wrap. You can cover bowls with it, bread, other baked goods, and what they're good for is keeping things fresher longer. Just like you might use a plastic wrap, you can replace your plastic wrap with these beeswax wrap. So I have noticed a significant difference, especially when covering homemade bread. I'll put a beeswax wrap over my homemade bread, put it in a bread bag, and it lasts so much longer. Same goes for cheeses and, you know, pieces of fruit, things like that. And what's nice about making your own beeswax wraps is you can customize them to the sizes that you might typically use in your kitchen. So you can make them bigger, smaller, whatever is gonna work best in your kitchen. So that leads me to talking about the pros and cons, so let's get into that. All right, so let's first talk about the pros. I already said that they keep your produce and baked goods fresher longer, and they are a great alternative to plastic wrap in your kitchen. What's also great is that with regular use and great maintenance, you can keep these going for 6 to 12 months. And what's nice is you can refresh them by adding a little bit more beeswax and keep them going for years to come. Now, at the end of your beeswax wrap's life, you can actually compost them. So really, it's a no waste or very little waste type of thing that you can have in the kitchen. And I really like that I'm reducing the amount of, aluminum foil and plastic wrap that I'm using in my kitchen. All right, we've talked about the pros. Let's talk about the cons because there are some. Number one is that you cannot use beeswax wraps with raw meat or really meat in general. And the reason is that the fabric can become contaminated. And if you're going to be using it again on fruits and veggies and whatever else, you can cross-contaminate. And that's just a big mess that you probably don't want to deal with. The second thing is that you can't use them with hot foods for obvious reasons. The hot food could melt the wax. Now, I feel like that's not a huge con because you probably wouldn't use plastic wrap on hot foods either. So, but that is a con. The next one is that you can't put them in the washer or put them in the dishwasher. You have to hand wash them. I don't feel like it's a huge inconvenience because typically what I'm using them for doesn't get the wrap dirty. You just use a little bit of cold water and some soap and let them air dry. It's really not that big of a deal, but for some it might be. So that's another con. A couple more reasons that you might not want to use beeswax wraps is that you can't use them in the freezer. Again, for me, this isn't a huge deal because if I'm going to freeze like a loaf of bread or something like that, I will either use plastic wrap or my reusable bread bags. I find that that works pretty well because I'm not leaving the bread in the freezer for really long periods of time, but that might be a deal breaker for you. I still find a benefit in using them in the refrigerator or just even on the counter with different items. So that's not a huge thing for me, but it might be for you. Beeswax wraps can also leave a residue on your bowls and cups and things that you might be using them on. I think you can just clean them pretty easily and it's not that big of a deal, but that is one downside compared to plastic wrap, as plastic wrap doesn't leave a residue on anything that it's covering. And then the last thing is that beeswax wraps can be expensive, especially if you're buying them from a retailer. Even getting the ingredients can be expensive depending on the method that you use. Again, I think making things on your own is a cost savings usually in general, and you have the ingredients on hand. These make really, really nice gifts. So if you've already got all of the ingredients, you can go ahead and make them for your loved ones, for birthdays, holidays, anything like that. But that is a downside. Next up, let's talk about the sizes that you might want to make your beeswax wraps and the different methods for making them. Now let's talk about the sizes that you might want to make for your beeswax wraps. So the smaller sizes are going to be good for covering things like mason jars or small pieces of fruit and veggies, while the bigger ones are going to be better for covering, loaves of bread and baked goods. So the sizes that I'm going to be making today are 9x9s, 11x11s, 15x15, which is going to cover like a larger bowl, and then 17x22.5, which I'm going to use to cover my loaves of bread. I'm going to show you all of that here in just a little bit. We're almost to the tutorial. The last thing I wanted to talk about are the different methods of how to use or how to make your beeswax wraps. Okay, so lastly, before we get into the tutorial, I just want to share with you the different methods and sets of ingredients that you can use in your beeswax wraps so that you can make a better decision of how you might want to go forward if you choose to make these. So first up, we have just beeswax on its own. And I made this using an iron, and I'll get into how to do that. You can see that it is movable and pliable, which is nice. It is a little bit stiff compared to the other ones, but definitely doable. Now, what I will say about this is when you're molding it around a jar or a piece of fruit or anything like that, it tends to crack a little bit, and that's no big deal, except that I feel like these might not last as long. I guess I haven't tried just the beeswax ones, but they do crack a little bit, and they take some time to use your hands to warm up that beeswax so that it can be molded and stick to whatever you're covering or stick to itself. Next up, we have beeswax and jojoba oil, and I made this the same way that I made the beeswax one, and that's with an iron. And you can see this one is also pliable and movable. And I think the benefit for using jojoba oil is that it softens the fabric a little bit, and you don't get that cracking as much as you do with only beeswax. So I'll just show you a comparison. You can see I'm holding them the same. It's not a huge difference, but I can feel that this one is definitely more pliable than this one. My tags are falling off. So let me cut to showing you how this looks when you're wrapping something. Again, it's going to be the same, that you have to use your hands to really warm it up before it'll stick to itself. Then the last method, which would be my chosen method if I had to pick between the three of them, would be with jojoba oil, beeswax, and pine resin. And so this is what it looks like. It's hard to tell on camera the differences in terms of how they look, but how they feel is different and how they perform. So you've got the benefits of the beeswax, which is sticky and will warm up in your hands as you mold it. The jojoba oil will keep it nice and pliable. And then we added pine resin, and that's what makes it sticky, where you really don't have to work to get it to stick. With the other two, you have to use the warmth of your hands to get it to stick to an object or to itself. And it still works, and that's fine. It's just not a really quick thing. So I can really quickly just wrap this over anything and it'll stick to itself. So that is the major benefit of adding the pine resin. It's definitely not necessary, and you can get beeswax wraps that work just as fine with only the simple ingredient of beeswax or adding in that jojoba oil. But if I had to choose any of them, it would be this. So now that you've seen all three different sets of ingredients and how you can make them, we're gonna get into the tutorial. So we're gonna start off with using the iron method, and I'm gonna show you how to make these beeswax wraps with just beeswax and I'll show you how to add in the jojoba oil if you choose. And then we'll go to the double broiler method and I'll show you how to make the beeswax wraps with the pine resin. So let's get into that now. So here are all the ingredients I have that I'll be using for both methods. If you're just doing the beeswax only, you'll just need the beeswax and your fabric. But I'm using beeswax pellets, and I actually do not recommend these specific ones I have in the video, but I'll link the ones that probably are better. These ones had a weird smell for some reason. But we've got the beeswax pellets, pine resin, jojoba oil, a clean paintbrush, the fabric, and pinking shears, which are going to help prevent fraying, but they're totally optional. As far as the fabric goes, I'm using just a standard cotton fabric that I got at Joann's. If you choose, you can do organic. I know a lot of people use organic fabric, and that's totally up to you. It is more expensive, but if that's concerning for you, then go ahead and do organic cotton. You could also do linen fabric. I don't know if I'd recommend any other types of fabric other than those two. But yeah, so we're doing the cotton fabric and I'm just giving everything a good press. I washed it, dried it, cut all the loose strings off, and then we want to do a nice press. I could have done a better job at that because my final product, a couple of them had some wrinkles in it. So make sure you give it a really nice press, and then we're going to go ahead and cut our fabric. Now I did various sizes, and I do have a blog post that goes along with this that spells out all of the different sizes that you could do, and I have a link to a really good guide that I found. But it depends on what you're going to be using your beeswax wraps for. So I did a 9x9, 11x11, 15x15, and then a 17x22.5. Those are going to work for a lot of different things, but I'm just going to go ahead and cut everything out. You of course can just use scissors, but I've got this rotary cutter tool that is actually really nice, and I found it to be very helpful in a lot of my sewing projects and things like that. But I'm going to go ahead and get everything cut, and then we'll move on to the next step. Moving into our first method of making these beeswax wraps, and that is with an iron. So I've just got an ironing mat, and then I have a piece of parchment paper. I'm putting my cut fabric on top, and then we'll sprinkle about a tablespoon of the beeswax pellets. Now this size is about a 9x9, and about a tablespoon, maybe just a little bit more, was perfect. You will have to adjust that up and down depending on the size. What's nice is that you can go ahead and melt everything and then adjust if needed. And then for this, I am adding in 1 teaspoon of jojoba oil. Again, that is totally optional. As I said in the beginning of the video, it does help to soften the fabric, but it's not necessary if you don't want to do it. So then I placed another piece of parchment paper on top of the fabric and the beeswax, and I'm just using my iron and pressing about 10 to 15 seconds in each spot, just moving it around. And you can see that beeswax melts pretty quickly, and you can see as I'm pressing, it's moving it along the fabric. And the goal here is to make sure that everything is nice and melted and that every part of the fabric is coated. So you can go ahead and peel off that top layer of parchment paper and just make sure there's no dry spots. And as long as everything is really nice and coated, that's all you have to do. And so after I'm done pressing, I'm going to peel that top layer of the parchment paper, and then very carefully, because it is hot, pick it up, and all you have to do is just wave it a few times and it's going to dry really, really quickly. And then as soon as it's cooled down completely, you can pretty much use your beeswax wrap right out of the gate. So that's what's nice about this method, is it's really super quick and easy, and it's very inexpensive. You can buy those beeswax pellets, or you can even buy a bar of beeswax. And so yeah, very quick and easy and inexpensive. Now moving on to the double broiler method, and I really just recommend this for if you're going to be adding in the pine resin. Otherwise, do the iron method. Like I said, it's really quick and easy. So I'm going to go ahead and get all of my ingredients into this mason jar. I am weighing all the ingredients. You definitely don't have to. And I have both measurements on the blog, but we're doing 2.5-ish ounces, which is about a half a cup of the beeswax pellets, and then about 0.8 ounces of the pine resin and 0.2 of jojoba oil. So for everything, that equates to about a half a cup of the beeswax pellets, 3 tablespoons of pine resin, and then 2 teaspoons of jojoba oil. Again, you can just measure out with your measuring spoons and cups, or you can go ahead and weigh everything out. Either way, it'll be just fine. Next up, we're going to go ahead and get our mixture all nice and melted. And what I'm doing is I'm adding everything into a mason jar and then putting that mason jar in a stock pot. I did put that washcloth at the bottom just because the jar kind of moves around as the bubbles start to form when it's boiling. But this takes about 30 or 40 minutes to get everything nice and melted. I wouldn't say this is the typical double broiler. Typically, you would bring water to a boil and put a bowl on top, but I didn't want to ruin any of my glass bowls. So I had to sacrifice that mason jar, but it is what it is. So once everything is nice and melted, I'm going to go ahead and just brush that on my fabric. I've got my fabric on a lined baking sheet. And once I've got everything coated, we're going to place that baking sheet into a 200-degree oven for about 5 minutes. And that's really going to help distribute all of the beeswax mixture to make sure that everything is nice and coated, including the backside of the fabric. As you can see, this mixture cools down very quickly, and so it's kind of hard to get everything perfectly coated. And so adding it into the oven helps to just, like I said, redistribute everything. But you can continue to do this method for all of your other wraps. I would suggest keeping that mason jar in the boiling water just to make sure that it's staying nice and melted. What I did was put it on top of a wax melter that I've got, and so that kept everything nice and melted. But if you take it out of the heat, as I said, it'll start to cool down and get gummy, and you probably don't want to mess with that. So just for the purpose of this video, I didn't do this in the kitchen, but I would recommend just keeping it, in the boiling water. That way it can stay nice and melted. So this is after about 5 minutes in a 200-degree oven. I'm going to carefully peel this up, and then same with the other method, just move it around in the wind. This one now will not cool like the other ones. So what I recommend is hanging it to dry overnight, and then it'll be ready to go the next day. Here are all of my beeswax wraps that I made. And I just think they're so pretty. It took me a little while to pick the colors, but I really, really love these colors. The final step for all of them would be to use our pinking shears. And again, this step is totally optional, but I like it because it does help prevent fraying. Now, if you don't have pinking shears, having that beeswax coating is going to also help prevent, fraying. But I just like the look of this, and so I went ahead and did this. Now you could cut your fabric with the shears first, and I did try that. However, I think it's much, much easier to do it after they've been completed, just because they're stiffer, and it can be kind of hard to cut, flimsy fabric, if you know what I mean. It does kind of gunk up your scissors, but you can go ahead and clean them and they'll be just fine. So I'm going to go ahead and get all of these cut, and that will be it. Now this step is totally optional, but I did get a Cricut, and so I've been playing around with it, and I thought it would be nice to have almost like a label that I could put over all of my wraps to give as gifts. So I just had a little bit of fun and created a little, I don't even know, it's a logo. I don't know, you'll see it here in a minute. I just thought I'd include it because I was excited. I had never used my Cricut to write, and so that was kind of fun. If you want the design of this, let me know down in the comments, but this was just a fun little addition that I made to go along with these beeswax wraps. Lastly, let's just talk about how to use, clean, and store your brand new beeswax wraps. So to use them, all you have to do is place your block of cheese, piece of apple, whatever it is, and just wrap it up. It doesn't have to look beautiful or perfect. You just want everything to be nice and sealed up. And like for cheese and things, I like to wrap it up like a little present. But it doesn't have to be perfect as long as everything's sealed. The beeswax wraps are going to help keep that food nice and fresh. And yeah, just store this right in your fridge and it'll keep it fresher longer, like I said. To use, all you need to do is get a little bit of whatever soap you use. It should be a gentler soap. I'm using Dawn, but you can use Castile soap. We're just going to give it a good scrub and rinse it in cool water. And then you'll just either hang it to dry or put it in your dish drying rack, and once it's nice and dry, then you can go ahead and use it or fold it up and store it. And to store them, just make sure that your wraps are completely dry. Go ahead and fold them up and then place them in a drawer away from the sunlight or any heat, and they're ready to use. All of the links to products that I used in this video will be linked down below, as well as a link to printable instructions if you would rather have them printed out so that you can look at them as you're making these beeswax wraps. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment down below and I'll be sure to get back to you. But thank you so much for being here. If you want to see more videos like this, make sure that you subscribe and hit that bell notification so you're notified every time I upload a new video. But I hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care.